Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to Linacre Alex Freeman, or perhaps as I should say, Baroness Alexandra Freeman of Steventon.
Thank you very much. I think Alex will do.
Well, we're going to come to the Baroness bit later on, but first of all, let's begin with your career in Oxford, because you started here in
92
1992.
in Oxford, yeah.
And Alex and I were talking just before we started about whether it's possible that I taught her. And I think it is likely that I did, but neither of us can remember each other. So I
Which
think
says
that
a lot about both of us.
probably says more about my lectures than it says about you as an undergraduate, Alex. Now, I've got to ask, because if you were in New College as a zoologist in the 1990s, you must have come across the famous Dawkins.
Yes, well, of course.
Tell us a little bit about that experience. Yeah.
Well, of course, I applied to New College because I was so inspired by Richard's books. I mean, growing up as a child, I was the sort of child who was obsessed with David Attenborough, Gerald Durrell, James Herriot, all of these great authors and storytellers. And I was also the sort of child that was bringing home every single animal, either trying to keep it alive or dissect it. But when I started reading Richard's books, I really started moving more from natural history into biology, and I'm trying to understand the science of it. And it was so inspirational to me, that gene's eye view, and for many people, of course, that I applied to New College because I wanted to learn more from him.
Yeah.
And I knew already from quite a young age that I was interested in science communication. And so learning the art of storytelling alongside the true art of scientific thinking, to me, was such a valuable experience. And he was a fantastic
teacher. That was going to be my next question, about whether you learned your storytelling craft from Richard Dawkins,
well,
and whether that was something
also very much from David Attenborough. And yeah, I think the art of storytelling, and Richard as a tutor was very hard on you if you pushed more in the storytelling direction than the science would allow. And that's what I needed.
Right.
Because I would, you want to glory and revel.
There's always a temptation.
There's a temptation to go further than the science should allow you. Yeah. And you need somebody like Richard to really constrain your thinking and allow your imagination to flow not outside of the channels of the science, but into the channels of the science, and to allow your imagination to think of hypotheses and experiments and ways of testing those hypotheses. So yeah, he was incredibly instrumental in the way I think. And yeah, very valuable experience.
Okay. Now, you could have gone on to be an academic, but you chose instead to go into a career in media. Every child's dream to go and
exactly. I'm not very imaginative. I just did what I wanted to do since I was age 5.
How did you get into science media production?
Well, I always knew I wanted to, and I did my PhD, my DPhil, with that in mind. So I chose a DPhil subject where I was going to be getting experience in animal behaviour and field experience with animals, which I knew was incredibly important if I wanted to work in natural history filmmaking. But whilst I was here at Linacre, I already started getting work, not paid work as a camera assistant and helping out on films. So I was very lucky to see an advert. They were looking for people to help with a film called The Secret Garden, and it was being filmed by a cameraman who lived in North Oxford. And so I helped out on that and spent a good few months driving around, building sets. People who were here with me might remember me trying to build sets up in the computer room in Linacre for different birds to nest in, where you could get the different camera angles and the lighting into the set. So yeah, I was learning the craft of behind the scenes camera work for the whole of those 3 years, and writing as well, and getting things published in BBC Wildlife magazine, that kind of thing. And all of that meant that I was able to slightly skip some of the work experience that you usually do after your degree, because I was intercalating it with my doctorate. So I stepped out of my DPhil able to get a job, which was fantastic. So I got my first job at National Geographic straight out of writing up. and did 6 months at National Geographic as a supervising researcher. And whilst I was doing that job, which was a 24/7 production with sleeping bags under the tables, which I learned was very much the way that the media works, this series called Walking with Dinosaurs came on television, and it was showing in the office because we were there in the evenings, and I was looking at it. And I'd done my undergraduate dissertation on reconstructing animal behavior from fossils, and I was looking at it thinking, I could do that.
This is me.
This is me.
Yeah.
So I looked at the end of the credits, wrote to the series producer because I heard they'd commissioned another series. And I had that awful thing where you print on a shared printer in the office and somebody else picks it up and read it out to the whole office.
How gruesome.
But at least in the media, everybody knows you're looking for your next job. So it was fine. But yes, I went to meet Tim Haynes, the series producer, and he gave me a job on the next series. So
and you were a researcher on that.
So I was a researcher on Walking with Beasts, the end of Walking with Dinosaurs, beginning of Walking with Beasts. So I had brilliant times, coming up with fur patterns for animals, painting eyeballs, working with the animatronics.
And let's revisit what you were saying about not going any further than the science will let you. I mean, Walking with Dinosaurs was one of those series where dinosaurs were brought to life for the first time using animatronics and computer graphics and so on. That gave you the capacity to tell far more than the science could possibly say.
Yes.
Was there a temptation in the dinosaur world to do that?
Well, I'm going to leave dinosaurs aside because I came in at the very end of dinosaurs, and mostly Walking with Beasts was my area. And you have to answer the question. So you can't have a black hole on the screen.
No.
Just because you don't know what colour a saber-toothed cat might be.
Yeah.
So you have to go to the best evidence. And actually, what's fascinating is trying to push the evidence and say, so what do we know? How do colour patterns evolve? Why are some striped, some spotted? What's the genetics? What can we look back at common ancestors? And all of this is fascinating science. And we had 3 years and we talked to 450 experts. So we really, really were getting to the best science possible for that.
Yeah.
And actually, it was that depth of research that we were putting in that made me think about everything else that can come around the television series. So the television series, for me, I thought of it like a trailer for all of the other stuff. And so I got involved with building the websites, building games. I was designing Key Stage 3 maths courses based on learning with Beasts, all of these other things, and making Walking with Beasts interactive, which then won a BAFTA for the concept. We hadn't even made it at that point. We got the award for the concept of having a scientific version of the narration and how did we know that and how did we do that, which meant that we were justifying what we were doing, but also allowing people to go, catch the imagination and then take them deeper into all of the research behind it.
Yeah. And I think the words that you use there, capture their imagination, are so important, aren't they? And I think what's so exciting about doing that sort of thing is that you're allowed to shake off some of the shackles of being a research scientist as an academic. And say, okay, this is the best evidence. It may be a little bit flaky, but this is the best evidence. And that sometimes can be very inspiring and exciting because it allows you to go to places which you can't go to as an academic.
Well, and I think, in a way, you can help drive the academic research because you ask questions which people might not have actually asked themselves before. How do we know what the tongue of a T-Rex looks like? And they go,
And those theories, I think, those series were, I think, hugely influential in inspiring a lot of young people to be interested in science.
Yes, it's embarrassing now how many people I meet who go, oh, I remember that when I was a kid, and you go, yeah, thanks. I was working on it. I was a bit older.
I remember vividly my daughter setting fire to a carrier bag held over a toaster in an attempt to make a hot air balloon, which I think was one of your ideas.
So after that and getting so involved in all the interactive stuff, then I found my way back into natural history. So I went to do the website for Life of Mammals. And then I actually pulled on all of my DPhil background to pitch a program called Test Your Pet. And I was thinking that, when we studied animal behavior, we'd have like 5 animals. You know, if you were studying dog behavior, you'd have 5 dogs that came into the laboratory, 10. So we've got millions of dogs, millions of owners who want to know more about their dogs.
So this is
why don't we have an
science?
Exactly. Why don't we have an interactive program where the dogs can have fun, the owners can be interested, and we all learn more stuff? So I went back to Tim Guilford and said, can we design some ethology experiments that people can do at home? And that became a Saturday night TV show. So I was so interested in, and I still am, in how science and society can come together,
work together in that way. Yeah. Now, just before we move on, a little bit more Linacre gossip. How did you and Jan Wong end up working together? Because Jan obviously became very well known for his involvement in Bango's The Theory, which you will as the researchers or producer.
I was transitioning to being a producer at that point, so I was screen testing. We'd had the request to help design a show that could be suitable to be a sort of Tomorrow's World. It was 7:30. It was for 7 to 14-year-olds and their parents. And we were screen testing, getting on for 50 different potential presenters, and we wanted a team. And, you know, you start thinking about all the people that you know. And Jan is a great potential presenter. And so I did a screen test with Jan. Since I had the kit with me, I was screen testing 2 or 3 people a day. And I said, come on, let's do one. And you know, we whittled down, and he made it onto the panel of 4 presenters that we had. And I ended up making a number of films with Jan. And as you said, Jan's thing was to really come up with scripts where it was hardcore science, but it was built around a demo and a thing that people could do at home or we could do on the street with people. But it was actually theoretically interesting science. And I hope you don't test me on what they all were, because they're quite hardcore, some of them.
Apart from setting fire to toasters, the only other one that I remember was the human-powered flight.
So that was a very big thing. So once I'd been making those smaller films, short films with Jan, I ended up being producer of the big shows, which were the big stunts. And that was with a presenter called Jem Stansfield, and he used to build things. He was an aeronautical engineer. And that was the most ambitious thing we ever tried, was to build a human-powered aircraft. And I mean, that ate our lives for a good few months, but we did just about manage to take off.
My memory is that you got about 1 meter off the ground, didn't you?
But considering that this is usually an undergraduate project, that people take a whole, you know, month, well, I don't think even undergraduates, I think it's graduates do it, and it's over, you know, multiple years, they pass it on. The fact that we were saying, can we do this in like 6 weeks for this amount of money, and people going, no. But we just about did.
What fun. Now, 16 years in what everybody would think would be the dream job that everybody would love. You suddenly decided to take a complete change of direction and went off to Cambridge to work at the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence.
Communication.
It's a complicated title.
Communication. I know.
Tell me, first of all, what lay behind that decision, and tell me a little bit more about the centre.
Whilst I was working, the programmes that I was making just before I left the BBC were, I was series producing a series called Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, which was a big BBC Two series with Michael Mosley and a team of other presenters. And I had discovered that when we went to sort of medical researchers and said, you know, people are asking us this, you know, are omega-3s actually any good for normal people who don't have a deficiency, or, you know, just everyday people? And quite often the answer was, well, we don't know. I'd say, well, why don't we know? Haven't you done trials? And they'd say, well, we do trials where we know that it's going to work. So we do trials in people who we know have a deficiency, or we have a theory that it helps dyslexia or whatever. And so few trials are done in general population because of all the pressures of wanting to get publication, wanting to find something where it definitely works. Trials big and expensive. You don't want to risk it in a general population.
Yeah.
And there quite often people were always also asking about supplements or exercise or things that there's really no big funding money behind. And so I started thinking, well, in order to answer these questions, we've got to partition some of the money. So I started partitioning part of our filming budget for running clinical trials, which is a bold move.
Such a challenge.
And a challenge at the BBC for all sorts of reasons. I really challenged the structure of ethical permissions, and I challenged the structure of recruitment for clinical trials and all of these things. But we got together a fabulous team who could basically run a clinical trial in 6 to 8 weeks within a filming budget. And that formed the backbone of these programs. So I was finding myself going back more and more to the actual science. Obviously, I was having to run an entire series and filming it as well, but I was becoming more interested in why are some things not being done. I was learning about a lot more about how trials are run and just generally getting more academic.
Yeah.
And then I had made a film with David Spiegelhalter, great statistician at Cambridge. So I followed him on Twitter. And one day he tweeted, "I've just been given a load of money and I need somebody to help me spend it." And I thought, that's a job I could do. I've been scrabbling around for money for years and years in filmmaking. Somebody's actually got some money. But it was in the maths department in Cambridge. And I thought, okay, it's for mathematicians. And then I read the small print and it wasn't. It was for communicators.
Right. So you became executive director there.
So I got the job as executive director there. And it really changed my entire perspective on communication. It's obviously quite late in life to have a massive epiphany, but I did. Because
tell me about that change.
So evidence communication is not the same as science communication. I didn't really think I was doing science communication anyway, but evidence communication is trying to give people the evidence that they need to make an autonomous decision. So you're trying to support somebody's decision making, which means that our motto was to inform and not persuade.
Okay.
So you have to be very balanced.
Decide whether to have a COVID vaccine or not. Absolutely. You're going to tell me whether it's risky.
Absolutely. And in fact, you've chosen the exact most, the example of our work that was probably the most public, which was we did the AstraZeneca graphics that we used on screen during the national broadcast when they talked about the blood clot risks.
Yeah.
So we are trying to help people who have a medical decision or have a political decision or have choosing education, any of these kind of big decisions. How can you present the evidence in a way that helps people understand it, but doesn't influence them one way or the other? So you've got to be incredibly balanced. You've got to be balanced about what evidence you show, because you don't want to cherry pick evidence, and then you've got to be.
It's a real challenge.
It's a real challenge,
yeah.
and then the way that you do it. So there are all sorts of ways that you can accidentally persuade. If I say 10% chance of something happening versus a 90% chance of it not happening, that gives you a very different perspective, and it makes it feel very different. So we researched. I had a research team of psychologists mostly, and then a team that included communicators, professional communicators, and computer programmers, because we were making online tools for the NHS as well that bring all of the graphics and the communication to healthcare decisions, and all sorts of others. We worked with all sorts of partners, DSTL, helping military commanders in the field who've got complicated decisions to make quickly under huge uncertainty. How do you communicate uncertainty without making the decision harder to make? All of these kinds of things. And it really changed the way I think about storytelling, because storytelling had been so much at the heart of my communication right from as a child. And yet storytelling can be incredibly persuasive, because you're leading somebody by the hand to an end point.
Yeah.
And as a filmmaker,
human societies have always used stories as a way of convincing.
And it's brilliantly engaging, because you engage people's emotions and then you control people's emotions. So the music you use and the pictures you use and everything, you're leading somebody through evidence on a path that you've predetermined for them. Whilst evidence communication, you want to leave the endpoint completely open to them. So you need to lead them into the evidence but not hold their hand all the way to the end point.
Yeah.
So it really changed the way that I think about storytelling, and then that led on to the way that we use storytellers as scientists and researchers.
Now, let's just talk a little bit more about the communication of risk.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the most difficult things to explain well, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, risk is it's just one of the forms of evidence. So, everything that we're talking about in the future is a probability. So it's all risk communication. Anything you're talking about, it may happen, it may not. Usually what we're talking about is the evidence shows that for 100 people like you, this 30 of them this happened and 70 of them this happened. And if you start thinking about it, instead of trying to project it into future risk and what's my personal risk, and think of it as what happened to 100 people like me in the past, what does the evidence show? It allows you to translate things into a much easier language for people to understand. It's very native for us to think about risk when we think about it of a room of 100 similar people.
Yeah.
So yes, and obviously I was running the centre in 2019, 2020, 2021 when a few risks emerged.
Very good moment to be doing.
There were a lot of risks to communicate, so we became extremely busy, and what had been a 5-year fixed term centre extended to a 7-year term.
Yeah. I guess that the challenge of communicating risks is not just about explaining probabilities in a way which is accessible, but also uncertainty and the risk of, for example, false positives.
Yes, absolutely.
Which can make an otherwise certain test or a certain outcome actually very unlikely.
Yeah. And there are all sorts of circumstances in which that comes into play. You've got to communicate the likelihood of something happening, the impact of that thing, and the uncertainty around it.
Yeah.
And that uncertainty might be quantified uncertainty, but it might be about the quality of the evidence underneath it as well, because you might have quantified the uncertainty, but you've only got a rubbish bit of evidence to start with. So you've got layers and layers of uncertainty, right from the probability uncertainty, because we never know what's going to happen in the future. So you've got the aleatory uncertainty, and then you've got the epistemic uncertainty, which is the uncertainty of your knowledge of that. And then you've got really deep uncertainties because you may not know everything. You may not know all the parameters anyway.
Yeah.
And so we worked on trying to communicate those different layers of uncertainty in a really intuitive fashion. And, I think a lot of academics and a lot of people in general have a very poor view of the general public and how they can understand these things. But people are people, and they're very sensible, and they're very used to making important decisions. And we find that people interpret uncertainty exactly as they should do, in quotes, as an expert would, if it's presented to them clearly.
The right evidence. Yeah.
So if you don't tell people that your evidence is low quality, people assume that it's high quality. If you tell them it's low quality, they expand their uncertainty bounds exactly as you would expect. So people interpret things much better than experts would like to think sometimes. So I never have any truck with people who are trying to patronize.
Yeah. Now, this is probably a question that you'll decline to answer, but tell me a little bit about the way in which you feel that metrics were used to influence decisions over COVID vaccination that weren't necessarily giving people the evidence that they needed in order to make the right decisions.
Well, no, I won't decline to answer that. I think there is no point saying something is safe and effective, because nothing's 100% safe and nothing's 100% effective. And we know that people can make very sensible decisions if you are open. And so we in the Winton Centre go very much by Baroness O'Neill's philosophy of trustworthiness. You can't expect people to trust you unless you are demonstrating trustworthiness. And so being trustworthy means being open about things and making sure that the evidence is accessible so that they can they can get at it, that it's usable, that it's presented in a way that's useful to people and that's accessible so that people can see where it comes from and assess its quality for themselves. And so around COVID vaccination, I would get cross with people who are trying to just tell you what to do or to make the evidence too simple, because we know that people can understand the evidence when it's presented clearly and make up their own decisions. And the decision whether to vaccinate or not is a personal decision, which is you making a choice about the risks and making the choices about the benefits and about the situation that you personally are in or your child is in. And people generally make decisions that are, they understand that vaccination is a pro-social move. So they understand, that you're not just doing it to protect yourself or your child, you're doing it to protect society and community and, the elderly and people around you. And if we're not being upfront about the potential risks, they will happen because bad things happen. Nothing's 100% safe. Things like the blood clots happen. And then that undermines trust because you haven't been trustworthy and you haven't been open about it.
Yeah.
So, we did that graphic about the AstraZeneca vaccine for the JCVI, the organisation that was making decisions about the vaccination programme. And we had to do it very quickly in high security because we had been given a sight of data that wasn't yet publicly known. And we did it for them to make a political decision on a policy decision, not a political decision, on which bands of people would get which vaccines. And that policy decision is going to be influenced not just by that data, but also on the availability of other vaccines. So if we only had the AstraZeneca vaccine, it'd be a different decision from if we have Moderna and whatever. And different in depending on what the risk is. So how prevalent is the virus? So we presented it in as helpful a way as we thought we could for them to make the policy decision. And then we had a phone call to say, we're going straight on air and we're going to use your graphics on air for the general public as well, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
And the JCVI said this information in this graphic should be available to everybody making a personal decision. And so, I think they were taking a very sensible route of, we're not going to just tell people what decision we've made. We're going to use the evidence to explain why we've made that decision.
Yeah.
And I hurriedly put together some notes for the journalists reporting it to explain why this information could also mean that other countries would make different decisions because it depends on the level of the vaccine, level of the virus in different countries, and also the availability of different vaccines in those countries.
Yeah.
So we have to explain why it's no good saying UK is doing something different from France. So this is why, because it's a very personalised decision. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, shortly after COVID, you made a decision to start your own sort of scientific journal. Called Octopus.
Yeah.
But it's not a scientific journal.
It's not a scientific journal, and I started it before COVID, actually.
Right. Okay. 2018.
Yes, ish.
Yeah.
Yes.
What prompted that? What were the inadequacies that you saw in the scientific publication? Scientific publication that you thought needed a remedy?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of different things. So as soon as I came back into academia from the media, I noticed. I mean, I'd heard about the publish or perish kind of thing, which is where researchers feel that they're being judged almost entirely on what they've published and where they've published it. So there's this big pressure to publish in journals.
They are.
Yeah. But I also saw on top of that, I heard my postdocs who are great and, coming from lots of different research cultures, saying things like, what story are we telling with our data here? And what narrative are we going to take in the paper? And I started thinking, the storytelling business, I'm not sure we should be dabbling in that. That's very dangerous double-edged sword storytelling. And it made me realize that a lot of the problems that we see and we know about reproducibility, so these are psychologists, so we're very well aware of reproducibility issues in science, p-hacking, harking, all of these different things that had become known to those of us outside of science, but were a problem within the research culture. A lot of it came down to the way that a paper is structured, because you're being forced to tell this nice linear story of, I had this idea, I went out, and guess what? I was right. And then you've just spent a lot of time and money doing something, and it turns out that that's not right. That's equally valuable. Science is all learning by trial and error. If you don't learn from the error, then you're not learning. So I think it was driving so many of these questionable research practices, this need to tell a linear narrative. And so I designed this new structure, which would basically support and incentivize best practice in research, which is publishing in smaller units. So you publish your research problem, and then anybody can come up with an idea of how that problem could be solved, and then somebody could propose a method, and somebody could then collect data. And in fact, 10 different people could collect data according to that same protocol, which was really useful to people.
So this is making science truly collaborative through almost a social media process.
Exactly. So it means that instead of us thinking of each of us as a researcher trying to build a really tall tower and sticking a flag in the top and going, this is my project, and the taller it is, and the more I've got a flag waving at the top, the higher profile it is, and the more glory I and my team will get. But nobody's looking at the foundations and really assessing the strength of the bricks. Instead, we're all putting bricks in different places in the structure, and the solidity of each of those bricks each publication is peer reviewed. So your data's peer reviewed, your method's peer reviewed. So we all know that it's solid. And then the towers are like an emergent property that comes out of the top. But it's a collaborative effort, and it's solid in foundation.
And how does the peer review process in Octopus work? Because that's one of the great weaknesses, I think, of scientific publishing at the moment.
Well, there's far more publications than there are people willing to peer review them. Is a massive problem. So on Octopus, you can publish. There's no gatekeeper, so you can log in, you can publish, it's free to use, it's free internationally. And then peer reviews are a type of publication like any other. So in Octopus, everything's linked to each other. So you don't just put your method in randomly. Your method has to be linked to the hypothesis or the rationale. That has to be linked to the problem that you're trying to solve. And your peer review can be linked to any of those. So because of that, they're treated and weighted like any other type of publication. So they're incentivized like any other type of publication. So they appear on your
And there's a scoring system within Octopus, which
we're working with a scoring system, which would be very controversial. So any metric that you choose that's like a proxy of quality has to be very carefully thought through, or you're going to drive things in the wrong direction again. So there is the potential to build. We have built it, we haven't decided on what the criteria are going to be, but a bit like a kind of, eBay or Amazon rating system where you can rate a publication on predefined criteria alongside peer review. So you can get some kind of quantitative metric out of it, but those have to be really carefully chosen, those predefined criteria, or, you could drive people all in one direction to try and...
And how does this system work alongside conventional journal publication and systems such as the Open Science Framework?
So we're trying to integrate as much as possible with places like the Open Science Framework or protocols.io or GitHub or any of the other places where people currently can put their work openly and freely. So in a way, it's kind of drawing those all together, and then it sits alongside a journal article. So the journal article is a bit like a television series used to be for me, the advert for all of the really juicy bits. The journal article is your advert for all the really nitty gritty of it. And we're a bit like, in Octopus, is a bit like the supplementary information, but in a really structured form. So you could have an article which then referenced the method where you go and get all the details and perhaps a video or whatever's useful for those who want to reproduce that. It's got a reference for the data where you can go and find it. So it can sit alongside a journal article, but a journal article for me is a form of dissemination of interesting findings, which might be useful to people. Octopus is the primary research record where all of that is recorded and critically where it's assessed, because there's no good assessing people on how good a storyteller they are, because that's not the same as being a good
scientist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Now, Octopus is flourishing.
Yes, it's doing well.
Yeah. I mean, you had a big injection of cash from RC UK, £650,000, which I think is a fair old vote of confidence.
Yeah, they gave us 5 years of funding.
Yeah.
So that's been great.
What happens at the end of that? Who pays for Octopus?
So that's what I'm busy on now, is working out how we can raise the next 5 years of funding. And one thing that we've just done is to integrate with the government research agendas from the different government departments. So now on Octopus, a lot of the research problems are pulled in directly from government departments. And when you attach your work, so you say, I've got a potential solution for this problem that the Department of Transport has, say, then you have a button that says, I want to share my details with that department. So not only do the department get lots of researchers who they might not have otherwise found, but researchers are getting evidence of impact, they're getting ways to talk to governments, so that's good for them. So we can now do that for any institution. So any funder who maybe puts out grant calls can publish those as come to us and create an institutional login, and then they can publish research problems, and then they can integrate their grant application system into that. So people who have ways of approaching those problems can attach them to those, use the same kind of mechanisms that we've built to basically have peer review as part of their grant application, all on the platform. So we're talking to funders about that, and we would charge the funders a fee to do that.
Yeah.
And that would pay for us.
Yeah.
And basically,
funders that might also overcome this problem of storytelling.
Well, exactly. I mean, people who are really good at pitching are not necessarily really good scientists again. Yeah. So I think so much of grant application is wasted work. You know, it's so much work to put in a grant application. Then peer reviewers have to come and peer review it.
8% of grant applications fail.
Exactly.
Which represents a huge amount of your researcher time.
Yeah. And we know from research that there's not really any difference between the ones that get rejected and the ones that succeed. So, you know, it would be much better if all of that were done openly, and you put your idea out there, other people peer reviewed it, it goes to that funder, but maybe another person will see it. And also funding could come in smaller units. So they might say, brilliant, we're going to fund some people to design the protocol to do that, and then that's all peer reviewed.
They then pass that on to the next team who are...
Well, somebody else could then say, and then they say, you know, now we're going to put up, say, £1 million between 10 laboratories who all collect data independently on that protocol. Much more reproducible science, smaller bites of funding, makes it much more meritocratic, and it helps get rid of some of the hierarchies that you see in academia, which... You know, hierarchies are bad for research culture. Yeah. So trying to solve everything.
Okay.
My usual approach.
Now, this is basically your idea, your baby, and you've taken on the huge task of getting this system up and running.
Yeah.
But then you decided to have another career change.
Yep. Wasn't.
Yes.
Changed again.
And went back to walking with dinosaurs.
Yes, you're quoting my maiden speech. So I applied to be in the House of Lords, and people don't know that you can actually apply to do it
as a job.
No, I mean, who knew? I was literally at the Winton Centre. I had wanted to close it because I'd wanted it to be a fixed term thing, because I think if you're constantly trying to raise the money to keep people in jobs, you're not thinking about things as projects and handing them over and giving them autonomy as projects. You tend to keep going, and I didn't want that to happen. So it was always going to be fixed term. And I thought, well, my skill set is very broad. You know, I've done a lot of things. I'm not an in-depth person in one thing. I'm very broad. And I was literally listening to the radio, and I heard Natalie Bennett, who is a Green Party peer, speaking. And she had just heard an interviewee talking about some science, and she said, it would be brilliant if we had people like that in the House of Lords who could really look into scientific evidence properly and then communicate it. And I thought, oh, that's what I do. And she said, yeah, people like that should apply. apply. So I Googled it and I
Yeah.
found it. And HOLAC, the House of Lords Appointments Committee, can appoint up to 2 crossbench, so non-party political peers a year, but they don't always get the go-ahead for 2 because it's in the Prime Minister's gift. And you can go to the website, download an application form, fill it in and send it in. So I did that.
Tell us about that process. I mean, it's fascinating.
It's just like a job advert. And
Yeah.
I mean, a job application. So I
Yeah.
filled in an application form, sent it off, and heard absolutely nothing for 18 months. And I thought, oh, well, that's embarrassing.
Yeah.
It's just gone in the bin. You know,
Yeah.
it's fine. It's
Yeah.
fine. Completely sort of moved on, forgotten about that. And then I got this email in my email inbox, which, you know, sometimes you get an email and you go, you what? It's House of Lords, and it said, please see the attached letter, and you double click the PDF, and it was an invitation to interview. And I was like, I'm just going to pour myself a drink now. And so I had 1 month before an interview. And so I went along to the House of Lords. I watched loads of stuff. I went to talk to people about it. I did all of the research about what actually is this job. Now I've got an interview on it. And did all the preparation I could for the interview. Went to the interview. And the first thing they said was, you're going to have this interview and then you won't hear from us for a long time because I'm afraid it's going to be months before we're allowed to make a decision. And so I had the interview and I didn't tell anybody about it. And I had the interview and then I was just waiting and months and months. And 3 months later, just at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, when I thought, well, you know, because I was beginning to think, oh, am I going to get a call or an email?
Yeah.
And then the phone rang.
Yeah.
4:30, so I wasn't nervous about it. Picture that, and I just said, you know what I'm going to say? And you might want to sit down. So it was, yeah. And
fantastic. And so everybody will want to know what happened then.
Well, I know. So, well, what happens then is that you're not allowed to tell anybody because lots of things have to happen behind the scenes and they have to get together how they're going to announce. So then you have an awkward weekend where you're not allowed to tell anybody the biggest thing that's ever happened to you in your life.
Yeah.
And then...
And did your family and friends notice that you were looking slightly frazzled?
No, I don't think so. No. But also I got, for the first time in my life, massive imposter syndrome. I was completely convinced that there would be a massive mistake and that somebody, you know, if I told anyone, then it was going to be amazingly embarrassing because I was going to say, oh no, I'm sorry, it was a terrible mistake. I misunderstood or they got the wrong person when they called them. So I had an awful feeling that this was going to happen. But then the press office called me and said, okay, we're going to do the announcement actually quite quickly. We're going to do it tomorrow. So, you know, can you line up what you might say if people want to interview you, and you can tell the people who were your referees, because I had 6 referees, so people who knew and had written reference letters for me. So I was allowed to tell them, and I told my family that this was going to happen tomorrow. Yeah. And then it happened, and then it's completely crazy because then nobody prepares you for what's going to happen, and it's like a kind of treasure hunt. You get an email that says, please can you call this number? It's Garter King of Arms. Okay, who's Garter King of Arms? I don't know. So I call this number and they go, can you come into the College of Arms as soon as possible? And so you turn up and they say, right, we need to decide on your name and title. And this was like 4 days after I'd just been told this news. I had no idea what this meant. And so you go through all this process and you suddenly learn about coats of arms and perennial names and all of this, and then he gives you another phone number. So here's the next person to call. Then you have to go through this process of calling people and then getting an induction, and then you have an introduction ceremony. And just before mine was due to happen, they called an election. So then everything goes on hold for the entire election.
Right.
And then everybody goes on summer holiday, so everything goes on hold for that. So yes, I didn't actually get to start work until I had the interview in February, I heard in May, then everything went on hold and I got introduced on the last day before summer leave, and then I properly started work in October last year.
Okay. And your maiden speech was?
Terrifying.
Well, and what did you speak about?
So I spoke on a debate on the role of science and technology to the UK economy. And there's a sort of strict formula for your maiden speech, and you're given everything in the house is done to the clock. So there's a big clock which isn't shown on the cameras, counting you down all the time, which is terrifying. But you're given 2 extra minutes. So I think I had 4 minutes plus 2 minutes, and you do 2 minutes introducing your background. And I tried to do that, sort of weaving in thoughts, and then I did 4 minutes on the importance of work that's done that sort of bypasses the Treasury, because I think, science and technology is often seen through the economic Treasury lens, but a lot of research has huge benefits to not having to spend money, for instance, because we've done some research that shows the best way to avoid reoffending or to do education or whatever.
This is change of practice, which will save us money.
Exactly. So I talked about the importance of that and how important it was to recognise that outside of the blue skies research and the research that has an obvious economic benefit.
And do you feel, it may be too early to say, but do you feel that you can have an impact? Do people listen? Do people change their minds?
Yes. So I've managed to, I've started on legislative debates, and I've started trying to put in amendments and learning how amendments to legislation work. And we've had some success, me and colleagues, so far on things like the data bill, talking about the importance of copyright to the creative industries, for instance. So that's a very big issue. And I talked about autonomous decision making and how important it is to have algorithmic transparency. But I'm also very interested not just in legislation, but in the role of the House of Lords and its place in society and its relationship to evidence. And so what I immediately started doing, the select committees in the House of Lords are amazing institutions where they basically get all of the world experts on a topic. They get them to come in, give oral evidence, and then they can bring it all together and synthesize it. And I thought, well, that's a documentary maker's dream. They get 20 experts. I rarely have the budget for that. So I thought, well, why aren't we using this expertise? It all go, the transcripts are available online, but who's going to find those? And the reports that come out are like 500 pages long. Nobody's going to read those. So I started a podcast where I cut the oral evidence that was given to a committee and put it all together so that people could hear it again. Trying to learn from my evidence communication, not to turn it into a narrative so that you're pushing in one direction, but so that people can hear from the mouths of experts in a way that's cut to make it, into useful sections for them. So I did that for the food diary.
Can we use that to help set the research agenda? Anyway.
Possibly, because you certainly find the evidence gaps, because there are questions that the committee will ask that the experts then can't answer. So I started with that, and I'm hoping to be able to continue doing that. But I also want to build in, as ever, the interactive side. So hearing from public voices into, first of all, the committees, maybe later the chamber, but using some of the direct democracy tools that are being developed so that we can hear voices and hear people's opinions into the House's committees. Because I think the House of Lords is so much less political than the House of Commons. And I think I think people will engage with it much more once we get rid of some of the myths about it, because it's not the terrible institution that you might hear from the press.
And do you have a team? I mean, being a cross-party peer, who do you work with, or are you on your own?
You're on your own. You're on your own. It's a kind of 0 hours contract. So you're paid for the days that you're literally in the building, in the chamber. People can use outside income. So you're allowed to have a second job, and you're encouraged to do so that you don't become ivory towered. And you can pay for your own team if you want, but I don't have the resources for that. So I'm still navigating. It's incredibly, you get lobbied all the time. And so you have to be incredibly guarded about who you're listening to. And obviously, because I've been working in the media, I have a network and I know how to find the people who are doing the actual research and have conversations with them and bring in the evidence from that. But again, you're trying to listen to as many people as possible, but also trying to check, what their motivations are all the time. So it's quite a lonely business, but the crossbenchers, I'm in there every day. There are other crossbenchers in there every day. And I'm finding the people, who know things about other things that I don't know about, and the people who are
that you enjoy working with.
Yeah, exactly. So, there are people who I will turn to if I want to know a lawyer's opinion or an economics opinion or whatever.
So a little bit like a college.
Yeah, and they're amazing people. I mean, the people that you get to sit next to, it's just such a privilege to learn about what they've done in their lives and what they're doing.
Yeah. Excellent. Alex, we're running out of time, so we'll have to draw this to a close.
Talk a lot.
But thank you so much for coming to chat to me.
Oh,
it's been fascinating talking to you, and we're so proud of your achievements. It's a real honour for the college to have you as one of our alumni. So
thank you.
Yeah, great. And we've got a lovely guest night dinner ahead of us. So
great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for those who've been listening, and let's go and have some dinner.
Lovely. Thank you.